Today, we have been graced with a visit from one of the more famous UUs in history. And she's going to be here to talk to us, to tell us about her life, her goals, and her achievement. In her own words, she's going to tell you all about everything that's happened with her and everything she's achieved, some of which we still have around today. So, let me present Miss Clara Barton.
I was born on Christmas Day in 1821 in a very small, tiny village called North Oxford, Massachusetts. Now, my given name is Clara Carissa Howard Barton, but all of my life I've just gone by Clara. They dropped the Clarissa. I had two sisters and two brothers, much older than I. They ranged from age 17 down to 11. So it was like I was the baby of the family, and all of them were my parents. They told me what to do, but they were each eager to help me, to teach me important things in life. Now, my father, Stephen, very important man in my life, was an Army officer in the Northwest Indian War in the late 1700s and also served in American Revolution. My father was a prominent member and outstanding giver in the local Universalist church. I remember that church as being very austere, with tall box pews and narrow little seats where the faith was hammered in, and an incongruent weather atmosphere in Massachusetts. I really preferred my father's resemblance in talking to me more about the Revolutionary War than all of the church business. He and I would spend hours in front of the fire talking about the battles and acting them out, talking about his military adventures. He taught me the very importance of serving our country and helping others. Now, my mother, Sarah, thought all girls should learn men's work, like chopping wood and nailing with a hammer. We should be prepared for anything that comes our way, she would say. Now, my two sisters, Dolly and Sarah, and for some reason they didn't use Sarah, they called her Sally, and they were already school teachers, so they taught me how to read when I was 3 years old. They taught me cooking, sewing, and cleaning. Now, my brothers, both David and Stephen, taught me boy things. They said that I would need to learn how to ride bareback and to throw and catch a ball. Now, Stephen was very good with numbers, and he made sure that I not only knew my adding and subtraction, but made me learn multiplication and division. We even studied fractions, and all of this math was extremely helpful in laying a foundation for the organizational skills that I would use later in my life. I started school when I was 4 years old. And I really impressed the teacher because I was the only one in the class that could spell the word artichoke. And I actually was able to solve all of the math problems she gave us that day. Now, after school, my job was also to take care of the sick and injured farm animals. When I was 11, my brother David fell from the roof of the barn. I knew how to help him heal from his injuries from his back and his head injury. Because he was bedridden almost 2 years, I never left his side except to get meals for him and I, and for me to clean up a bit. I was really afraid to leave him. The doctors had refused any more treatment and left him to die. By the time that Dave recovered, I was quite good at nursing. It just seemed so natural. And since I knew how to care for others, sometimes I would even babysit for the neighbors. Didn't make much money, but it sure was fun teaching those little kids how to do math and to read. Now, once David recovered, I really missed being a nurse. So around the same time, many children in our community came down with smallpox. I nursed them even at age 13, and I knew it was probably likely that I would get smallpox if I had to, but I just had to help them. Now, I did have a mild case, probably working so close, I probably, as you know something today, that was something developed in my body called antibodies. It was actually like having a vaccine. Of course, we didn't know those scientific facts and figures in those days. I did not realize that I would eventually transform the nursing profession of America, much like Florence Nightingale did in Europe. Now, she and I were very close in age. She was born in 1820 and I was born in 1821. We never met, but we corresponded frequently. Now, let's go back to my childhood. My mother was very worried about me when I was 16. I was very shy and timid and liked to spend a lot of time alone. As a child, I was afraid of everything: snakes, thunderstorms, and sometimes even people. I would hide behind the curtains when they would come to visit. So my mother decided to have me seen by a phrenologist. Now, this is a man that would come in and measure my skull, feel all the various ridges, and he said he could determine my strengths and weaknesses by his very touch. Now, his final recommendation that he thought that would rid my shyness, for me to go and teach summer school at 16. Men taught during the full-time school year, but only young girls could teach in the summer. So a year later, I found myself at 17 in front of 40 pupils, some as old as I. My sister and I had made me look older. She put up my long hair and fitted me with a little fancy dress, which made me look a lot older, and she told me, "Lie about your age." Now, as I got older, I told folks that I was a lot younger because my real age was never important. I never saw the reason for that. So I started teaching those summer school classes and helping them read out loud, and then I watched my shyness disappear. Now, at recess, the boys were amazed at how I could throw a ball and catch it when they sent it to my way. That little project helped me win them over in the classroom. Now, I made a lot of money that summer. I made $2 a week. Now, when I was 18, I was offered another teaching opportunity. However, it was a full-time year in the school. Most men were teachers, but they said they would also give me $2 a week at that. I told them, I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I will never do a man's work for less than a man's pay. Finally, the school board agreed. So over the next 10 years, I tried and strived to be the best teacher. In 1845, I raised enough money to build a school for the poor children that were from the Irish and German mill workers. I was what they call today as an ESL teacher. That meant the English was their second language. And I believed that all should have an opportunity for their education. Now, in 1850, I was still living at home, almost 30. I took a bold step and I enrolled in Clinton Liberal Institute in Kirkland, New York, to further my education. Now, the school was over 200 miles away, and I had never left the community of North Oxford. Now, this helped open up the future for me, as I knew that I would end up traveling alone as my life progressed. But sadly, my money gave out, and I was not able to complete the program. So 2 years later, I moved to New Jersey and started a school for poor children there that couldn't attend the local schools. On the first day, I had 6 boys show up. The next day, 20. And before I knew it, I had over 600 students. They had to build another building. And when they opened this large building, they decided to hire a man as the principal and offered him $600 a year, and I could be his assistant for $250. Because the job of a principal was just too hard for a woman to do. I was very shocked. I was very distraught, and I could not even eat. I grew very thin and weak, and even my voice began to fade away, so I just resigned. And in 1854, I eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and was offered a position as the very first female in the U.S. Patent Office, making $1,400 a year, paid as much as a man in the same job. Now, that was a far cry from that $250 that they wanted to offer me as that assistant principal. I quite enjoyed my job as a clerk, and my job was to hand copy all the submitted patents. Now, one day, for example, I actually copied the patent on the invention of toilet paper. The men at the patent office were very rude and ugly to not only myself, but all women. The management decided they would solve that issue and just fire all of them except me. So I decided to challenge myself. I copied 2 weeks of work in just 6 days, and then eventually they eliminated my position. I had to go back to teaching, and 3 years later, they offered me my old job. Now, one of my friends introduced me to President Lincoln, and he told me that I would have a job in the patent office for as long as I wanted, and that he knew that I would do a good job, and I felt that I was going to pave the way for women to be treated equally with men. Now, when I was 40 years old and not knowing what the future would hold, the outbreak of the Civil War started in April the 12th, 1861. It sort of launched me into my life's work. I spent hours helping the homesick, the suffering soldiers, nursing them back to health, writing letters, and offering them kind words and prayers of comfort. And with no formal training, my nursing expertise all came from caring for my brother David. Of course, a lot of common sense, courage, and compassion went a long way. Now, at the battles of Cedar Mountain, Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Antietam, I assisted the surgeons in helping stitch up wounds, even helping with those bloody amputations. Now, I was really only allowed to go to the edge of the battlefields. Most soldiers were brought to the edge to be helped. In 1862, I was finally given permission to distribute supplies to the Union soldiers throughout the camp. Knowing that nurses were urgently needed for injured soldiers, I decided, so to speak, is to break away those shackles that they had me on the edge and to dive into the battlefield. I discovered that there I found many of my previous students had volunteered for the Army. They were without supplies. So I thought it would be a good idea to write letters back home to Massachusetts and ask them send needed supplies. Packages began to come in steadily, and I took them to the battlefield. But it was just not enough. Soldiers were dying for the lack of doctors, nurses, and the rest of supplies to save them. Now, one day, I dug a bullet out of this guy's cheek with my own pocket knife. Because there was no doctor around, I said, I think I know how to do this. Then another day, a bullet flew between the soldier and I that I was caring for and went right through the sleeve of my dress. But it killed the man laying beside him. And now that was a scary feeling. Many nurses were frowned upon their families. It was not really ladylike to be on the battlefield. It brought shame to their family. I'll tell you a story about that Battle of Bull Run. When I arrived on the battlefield, I found that men had not eaten for days. How would they be able to heal if they had nothing to eat? So I gathered up every cooking utensil I could find. I found 2 water buckets, some tin cups, a kettle, a stew pan, some lanterns, some knives, and 3 plates. And with all these simple tools, I learned how to put everything together from those days of cooking with my sisters. I cooked enough soup to feed 3,000 soldiers. Now, how did I do that? I used boxes of canned vegetables that were sent, and I used the empty canning jars to serve the soup to the soldiers. So my mother and sister were very proud of me. A few months later, I had a long conversation with my father. Remember, he's a war veteran. And he told me that nursing the wounded on the battlefield was not shameful and that one day it would bring me great respect. My lifelong shyness and being a timid woman eventually disappeared. I learned how to stay calm and be very resourceful as I nursed those soldiers' wounds and their illnesses. I fussed over these men and called them my boys. One of the surgeons wrote General McClellan and put a word in for the horrid conditions that we were working under. In that letter, he referred to me as the angel of the battlefield. I know that many soldiers died from illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and TB rather than from their war injuries. But as my father predicted, this made me famous. Now, my dad died at home in 1862, and on his deathbed, he encouraged me to continue the patriotic support to make me famous and to work with the men in war. It was my job to be any place the bullet and the hospital was. Pain and suffering did not take sides because I wanted to help all soldiers, black, white, Union, and Confederate. Now, after the war was over, I actually put together a national effort to locate soldiers who had been missing in action. I set up an office in Washington, and I actually lost count of how many letters I actually received, but I know thousands were sent to my office. I found information out by long, long hours of searching. I found 22,000 soldiers. Some had died, some were sent home, and some had arrived home alive, but there were still others missing. Now, while I was away doing my war work, there was another lady in the patent office working under my name, and they paid her half the salary she was happy to get and saved the other half a salary for me. But both of us eventually lost that job. So in 1863, I decided to go to South Carolina to join my brother, who was now Captain David Barton, Army Quartermaster, and his son, David E. Barton, who was only 15, but he was already doing his military work in the telegraph office. It was in South Carolina that I met Miss Fanny Gage. Now, she was a lot older than I am, so I called her Aunt Fanny. She encouraged me to continue my work on the Missing Soldier Project, and she said, "We can submit a petition to Congress to get a grant for $15,000 to help you with this project." I thought, that's a lot of money. That would reimburse me $12,000 I've already spent of my own money, and I could take $3,000 for my next project. Now, I was never very good at keeping records, except in my head, but the government never questioned me, and they gave me the $15,000. Now, Aunt Fanny and I decided to travel to New England, and she suggested I should start giving lectures and telling stories on the battlefield and what it was like to dodge bullets and to use corn husks as bandages. Can you believe that I got paid for these lectures, that many of them were held in churches? They would pass the offering plate, and I would go home with money of $75 to $100 just telling stories. This money could be used to buy many more battlefield supplies. Now, the lecturing was not easy, and sometimes my shyness would come back, but nonetheless, it helped me pave the way for being a feminist for the rest of my life. During that time, I met Susan B. Anthony, and we spent many hours talking about women should have the right to vote. One woman told me that I was living proof that women were every bit as courageous, intelligent, and resourceful as any man. Somebody asked me one time why I didn't marry, and I said, well, I've had my share of romances and love affairs just like other girls, but I just couldn't find the ideal husband. I needed to be able to move around in the world, and that would free me up. I did not want to be bound to the matrimonial ties. Now, my health began to suffer again, and while I was on my speaking tour, a doctor had seen to me and suggested I should go to Europe and rest and try to recuperate, because he said, you need to leave this country because they will not let you rest. They always find something else for you to do. So I traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, and to rest there with some friends of my family in the clear, clean mountain air. Now, while in Geneva, I met Dr. Louis Appia, a surgeon. He came to visit me because he had heard of my work on the battlefields. He said, you must go with me. I need to introduce you to the group of men that are together have formed the International Red Cross. Now, their Red Cross flag was like on a white background, but I figured out it was actually the reverse of the Swiss flag. I became very impressed with that organization, as it was neutral, because it cared for soldiers from both sides and as well as the helpers on the battlefield. It protected those from harm and would not take those folks as prisoners. Then I found out there were already 32 nations that belonged to this International Red Cross, and the United States was not one of them. Our leaders in Washington says you have to be very cautious of those foreign entanglements. Now, war between France and Germany broke out in Europe, and once again I volunteered to help. I was supposed to be resting, and the Grand Duchess of Baden opened up a sewing room, and she and I started to put clothes together for war victims. And for this endeavor, I was awarded the Cross of Merit as a medal. It is one of my favorite possessions, and I wear it even when I'm in my garden. Now, when I returned to the U.S. 3 years later, my sister Sally had become very ill with cancer, and I went back to New England to nurse her. She began to feel better and encouraged me to leave, as I had been there for 6 weeks. I got the news I needed to return to her, but by the time I reached her, she had died. I became very ill with an emotional breakdown. I was exhausted and depressed and could not talk, see, or move. I then had to be admitted to the hospital and nursed in Dansville, in New York. When I was discharged, I had to buy a house so that I could have a safe place to rest. Now, in 1873, I decided to return to Washington to lobby over the next 8 years to the United States to try to ratify this Red Cross treaty. I met with President Rutherford B. Hayes. He was very intrigued with my idea, but passed me on to the State Department. Now, Susan B. Anthony and myself decided to meet outside of the State Department with a group of veterans and met with a group of supporters and reporters and to help us get more publicity about what we were getting ready to do. Now, finally, President James Garfield gave me approval to have a chapter of the Red Cross in the United States shortly before he got shot. I feared his successor, President Chester Arthur, would actually oppose this organization. But in December 1881, his speech to the Senate actually praised what the Geneva Convention was all about. So in 1882, the U.S. finally officially became a chapter of the International Red Cross, and when I was 59, I founded the American Red Cross and served as its president for 23 years. I did not retire until I was 83. The government refused to give us funds, so we raised our own money to support our endeavors. Now, unlike the International Red Cross, only helping during war, I believe that we should go beyond that principle and help people during natural disasters such as fires and floods. So in 1883, just a year after I started the American Red Cross, I heard about this dreadful flood that was in Ohio and Indiana. I rented myself a few steamboats and took supplies to the flood and helped those folks rebuild their lives. One boat would come down the river and drop the lumber for the house, a one-room house, of the floor, the ceiling, and the windows. Now, the next boat that would come down river would bring beds, linens, the stove utensils, and some groceries. Now, one time when the Mississippi River flooded, we raised $10,000 just to have seeds to help them replace the flooded crops. I was called on so many times to take charge during peacetime and relief work of many parts of the world. I came to Florida to help with the yellow fever epidemic in 1887. In 1889, we took a mission up to Jonestown, Pennsylvania, where I was there for 5 grueling months, helping them move and build one-room furnished homes. All of our supplies of lumber and food were actually donated for this project. Now, there was one request after another in the U.S. that would come from abroad, and one time we actually went to Russia to help with the famine and to the Armenian massacre in 1896. In 1900, the great hurricane hit Galveston, Texas, and 6,000 people were killed by the storm in just one day. Besides the routine supplies, we brought over 1 million strawberry plants and helped them plant them along with potatoes and corn to have food to sustain them. We stayed in Galveston for 2 months so that we could see those crops pop up from that new till soil. After all this work of the flood after flood, it began to take a toll on my health, and I was looking old, so I dyed my hair black. I began to wear a little makeup so that I would appear to be much younger. I didn't want others to think I was too old or too weak to continue my work with the Red Cross. Then, in 1884, Congress had asked the Secretary of State to get with me so that they wanted to send me to the International Conference in Geneva on behalf of the U.S. I was the first woman that ever had been chosen to represent the U.S. in an international event. They were so impressed, they actually came back and made the American amendment to the treaty. Now, in 1898, at 77, my nephew, Stephen E. Barton, received a telegram and was requesting the American Red Cross to bring supplies to Cuba. We provided food and shelter and clothing to the Cubans during the Spanish-American War, and Tampa was our gathering point for the Army. Now, while we were here in Tampa, Teddy Roosevelt, then a colonel with the Rough Riders, had tried to buy supplies from me. I told him they were not for sale, but I would freely give them to him. Tampa was a port from which all of those supplies came into, and we organized them in order to get them shipped to Cuba. We set up camp near the Plant Hotel, and all the Cubans living in Tampa and even as far south as Key West came to help us with those supplies. We offloaded the supplies from being delivered and snuck them on smaller boats past the military so that we could get on with our delivery. Now, even though that I went to the Plant Hotel many times, sometimes I would actually stay at the Arno Hotel in Tampa because it was a little bit cheaper. Then oftentimes I might be invited to stay in the home of Dr. and Mrs. Town Mack in their home on Plant Avenue. And I want to show you, I actually have saved this receipt for 2 weeks for room, board, and meals for myself and Dr. Elwell, and they charged us only $22. President William McKinley said, without my leadership, the American Red Cross in the U.S. would have failed to meet all of those needs in Cuba during that Spanish-American War. There were over 6,000 deaths, and 90% were those from the wounds of the war, not from wounds, but from the disease. Meanwhile, things weren't going very well in Washington, and the American Red Cross began to try to split up into rival groups. And my position as president was in jeopardy. So then in 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated. He was the kindest, most solid supporter to me. Now that made 3 presidents that had been assassinated in my lifetime. That new president was Teddy Roosevelt. Now, later in life, I became very keenly interested in spiritualism and Christian Science, but I never joined the Christian Science church. I didn't want to be considered a churchwoman. I affirmed my Universalist faith in a letter that I sent to the Ohio Inquirer. Let me read you one sentence. I believe that in your belief, I am a Universalist, and it is correct as you have thought of this, and I considered it to be a privilege to rejoice. In my case, it was a great gift. Like St. Paul, I was born free and saved from the pain of reaching out, of having to have struggle and doubt throughout my years. Now, my father was a great leader in the church in which Jose Ballou preached his first dedication sermon. And historical records show that that old Huguenot town near Oxford, Massachusetts, was erected as the first Universalist church in America. In the town that I was born in, I had taken part and was looking anxiously in a time of the near future in the busy world that would let me become more part of this community. In 1904, now in my 80s, I have been forced out of my position, and because they claimed I mishandled the funds, said I stole large sums of money. Now, one time I did transfer $3,000 and hid it because the bank is always closed when we get ready to go. Sometimes we have to leave on Sunday, and you know all the bankers are at church. So, as I said before, I never admit to like keeping perfect records, but I kept those figures in my head. I rarely had time to write them down because I had given most of my life and a lot of my own money to the American Red Cross. My accusers called me bossy and stubborn, and I finally just resigned in 1904 before them forcing me out. The Senate then convened to have an investigation, but they found me innocent. I had a large house built in Echo, Maryland. I moved the entire headquarters from Washington. I remodeled this large house to give me a little tiny living space, and I could use the rest of the house for supplies and made it into a warehouse. Now, after I retired, I was 83, and I decided to start another organization called the National First Aid Association and appointed the president. And I had many years of nursing and was certainly an expert in first aid and emergencies, and those first aid courses are still carried out through the American Red Cross. Now, that position, after I retired and was even though I was president, just didn't keep me busy enough. I returned to my writing. I wrote a 700-page entitled Red Cross in Peace and War in 1898. Then in 1905, I wrote a shorter book called The History and Story of the Red Cross, Glimpses at the Fieldwork. And my last book was the story of my childhood that was published in 1907. I became quite ill in 3 months, suffering with pneumonia with a complication of TB. 2 nights before I died, I dreamed that I was on the Civil War battlefield taking water to my boys. This illness finally took me on April the 12th, 1912, at the ripe old age of 91. My published obituary had had a major mistake. Someone said my brother Stephen was at my side. Now, that could not possibly have happened when he died in 1865. The Stephen Barton that was in the obituary was actually my brother's son, my nephew, who had worked very closely with me in the American Red Cross and had come to live with me to care for me to the very end. My funeral was held in Glen Echo. As my casket was taken back to Oxford, Massachusetts, the wagon driver found out I was the one being transported. He dropped the reins of the horses and said, "My God, this is the body of Clara Barton." He explained to the crowd that I had nursed his father at the Battle of Antietam and saved his life. Thanks to the perseverance and hard work, the American Red Cross is the largest humanitarian organization in the United States. Long after I was no longer around, I have 26 schools and 13 streets named after me and a stamp in reference to my work in 1948. I'll leave you a quote from one of my books. "All the relief that has been administered was not as charity, but as God-sent support to our brothers, our sisters, who have been overwhelmed by some mighty convulsion of the force of nature and war." Thank you. I have to tell you that the Red Cross pen, I have never worked for the Red Cross, but this Red Cross pen was given to me by my great aunt when she worked with the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C. office in the 1920s. Thank you.